Good morning. We'd like to call the Investment Committee meeting to order. First order of business will be to call the roll.
Rob Fechner,
Good morning.
Teresa Taylor,
Here.
Margaret Brown, Henry Jones, Fiona Ma, represented by Frank Ruffino,
Nobody yet.
Lisa Middleton,
Present.
David Miller,
Here.
Stacey Olivares,
Here.
Irena Ortega, Jason Perez, Mona Pascual Rogers,
Excused.
Ramon Rubalcava, Betty Yee,
Thank you. Item 2 is the approval of December 16th timed agenda. What's the pleasure of the committee? Moved by Taylor. Seconded by Miller. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Item 3, Pledge of Allegiance. I've asked Board Member Miller to please lead us in the pledge.
Stand and face the colors, hand over heart. I pledge allegiance
Thank you, and please show Mr. Ruffino has now joined us. Before we go to item 4, I do want to say item 6I and 6J, the climate change report and the responsible contractor policy are being pulled off the consent calendar, and we will have discussion on those. Brings us to item 4, executive report. Mr. Meng.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Investment Committee. So today, this morning in the open session, we have a relatively light agenda. So item 6, we have 10 information consent items. And as you just pointed out, the last 2 of the 10, 6I and 6J, are being pulled. And item 7 is a second reading of the investment policy revision for private asset classes. And item 8 is the consultant review report of Calpers divestment. And item 9 is the continuation of the board education workshop. So this will be the last of the 4. So if you recall, the first one we had was in May on the return, risk and return basics of the total fund. So that first education workshop by CFA Institute, it was in May. And then in June, we had the second workshop on global fixed income. And then in August, the third workshop on global equity. And then today is the last workshop on private markets. So with that, I'm turning back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Brings us to agenda item 5, the approval of the November 18th meeting minutes. What's the pleasure of the committee? Moved by Taylor.
Second.
Seconded by Olivares. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Item 6, the information consent items. We've pulled off items 6I and 6J. So let's start with 6I, the climate-related financial risk. Mr. Meng.
Yes, I'm just waiting for my colleague to come
Very
up.
good. Thank you. And this was pulled off as a request of a number of board members who thought that it was important that we have an open dialogue so that everybody understands, both the audience and the board, rather just being in written form.
Yes, we appreciate that.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Danny Brown, Calpers team member. This item is our initial draft of the public report required by SB 964, a bill that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Brown in 2018. The bill requires Calpers to publicly report on the climate-related financial risk of our public market portfolio, including alignment with the Paris Agreement on climate change and the California climate policy. This first report is due on January 1st, 2020, and then we'll issue a report every 3 years until January 1st, 2035. The investment office has put a lot of time and effort into this very informative report, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ann Simpson now, who will kind of briefly summarize the report.
Thank you very much, Danny. I'm joined here by Beth Rickman, who leads our Sustainable Investment Integration team in the Investment Office. But I do want to acknowledge that many people from different sides of the organization have contributed to this first effort under this important piece of legislation from our legal department, our public affairs, our legislative affairs, and of course the investment team across the total fund, including the asset classes as well. Let me just highlight for you briefly how we've structured the report, and then Beth will be here to answer any questions that you might have around the way that we've gathered the data. The first part of the report really focuses on the history of Calpers' understanding of climate change as a risk and as an opportunity. So in the report, we recap the important work that was done back in 2012 to review evidence through the Sustainable Investment Research Initiative, then the way that fed into Calpers' investment beliefs, where both in the understanding of value creation, climate change is called out, but also in our understanding of risk, being multifaceted. Climate change is specifically highlighted. So we have it called out in two of the investment beliefs, if you like, on both risk and return. The second important area of work for Calpers on climate change was how this understanding of the issue fed into the development of a strategic plan on sustainable investment, which the board adopted in 2016. And this has climate change as one of 6 priorities for this 5-year plan, which has got time-bound KPIs. And the focus in that work is to ensure that we are using our influence as an owner of companies to bring down emissions. And you'll recall in our work under the Montreal Pledge, Calpers found that 100 or so companies in our 10,000 plus portfolio were responsible for the bulk of the emissions in some extraordinary work done by Divya Mankikar, who's here today. What that meant was that we could form a partnership with other large investors with the goal of bringing those emissions down. That's Climate Action 100 Plus, which now has over $35 trillion in assets under management signed up. So in the report, we give examples of how that work is having real impact on our engagement strategy. We've also highlighted what we're doing on advocacy. I would say that Divya has just come back from the COP meetings in Madrid. So Calpers has had a presence right from the beginning with the Paris signing in 2015. We're also working hard on issues like carbon pricing coming out of a Vatican dialogue, which Betty Yee attended this year, along with other investors alongside Calpers. And then vitally important in the strategy is integration, and this is the work that Beth leads, which is where we're using very imperfect data sets to understand where risk resides and where there is opportunity. So this call in the legislation for us to report on our climate risk is something that we welcome, because Calpers has a track record of commitment on this issue, of understanding how it affects risk and return. But we're also very humble because the data that we're working with are thin and frail. Just on carbon emissions alone, less than half of the companies we invest in public markets give us any sort of reporting. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Another of our priorities in the strategic plan is around improving data and corporate reporting. And last week, we were just delighted to see that the International Financial Reporting Standards Body has issued guidance on how climate risk should be integrated into the financials. So this is just a tremendous development, and we're really thrilled. We've also been working through groups like SASB and through our support for the TCFD, which is an almost correct acronym for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Through these voluntary measures, we've also been trying to get better data. So finally, in the report, we look ahead. We talk about things that are coming up, which include a commitment to produce our own first asset owner TCFD report, which will be a great challenge, but it's something that Calpers is committed to. We have a roundtable on carbon pricing with Notre Dame University and the Vatican coming up in June, and we highlight a number of other activities ahead as well. I also just want to say that Brad Pacheco drew to my attention this morning that Chief Investment Officer magazine has just nominated, not just nominated, but agreed that our Chief Investment Officer has won an award for innovation in this space, which I think is a great credit to Ben's commitment on this issue, and also an op-ed on the issue of climate risk by Marcy Frost, our Chief Executive Officer, is published today in Cal Matters. So Calpers' presence in this area, I think, is very strong. However, I would say two things. We have ambition, but we also have humility. So this first working draft we're presenting to you really to get feedback. We presented it to the stakeholder group on Thursday, and they had some interesting ideas for us, but we look forward very much to your thoughts and suggestions on how we can improve this before it's filed with the legislature. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, so first of all, I would like to say thank you for the good work. This is truly an example of a teamwork. It represents the collaboration between the CEO's office of Danny Brown and Ann Simpson, and the investment office with Beth, myself, and the ISI team. And for the teamwork, I really want to highlight one person, which is Ann Simpson. I really want to thank her for her deep domain knowledge and her clear thinking and clear writing style, so which has proven to be very useful to this task force. On the award of winning the ESG award from the CIO magazine, I have to say, on the record, when they interviewed me, I do not deserve any award. I'm fully committed to it. I am receiving the award not because of what I have done, it's because of what you have done. And it just I'm the person who in this seat, so I'm receiving this award, but on behalf of this organization, which I'm very proud of. And to the question, I'm very committed to climate action and sustainable investing. So to put that on the record, I do not deserve any award. I'm here receiving an award on behalf of what you have done.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And Grace report. I do have a couple of requests from board members. Ms. Yee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the report and congratulations on the award. And I also want to add my thanks to Ann for her deep knowledge and really the longstanding work that was really spearheaded by her here at Calpers. And if there's anything I would say about the report, I think it actually understates some of the work that we've done. And a couple things I wanted to highlight, if I could. The proxy vote section I thought was a bit vague, but there's been so much intense work done in that arena that I really would like to see that elevated some more. I think we're probably a leading voice in so much of this for so many periods of years that I'd like to see that expressed a little bit more forcefully. And then also, I thought the engagement section was a little condensed. Obviously, engagement is something that we take very seriously. It's really what has guided us with respect to our actions on the more global initiatives that we're a part of, and so I would hope that we could expand on that a little bit. What I didn't understand, and maybe you can explain a little bit more, but in terms of looking forward, about CalPERS in 2020 publishing a TCFD-aligned asset owner climate risk report. So does that mean we ourselves are going to report with respect to CalPERS along the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's called leading by example.
Okay.
We're calling on all these companies to do this type of reporting. And as you know, on their website, Marcy Frost, our Chief Executive Officer, is there with a public statement of support for TCFD. So, of course, then the question is, well, what are you going to do? However, Beth has been doing preparatory work on this, and I think she'll attest to the fact that this is not a simple thing.
Right.
So we're looking at the first quarter of 2020 for pulling that together. But again, it will be certainly something where we'll be learning as we go.
Beth Rickman, Sustainable Investments. Just a few things I would add to that are that we are looking across our total fund for that report, whereas this focused in response to the SB 964 sort of mandate to focus on the public sector.
That makes sense. But that also would be dependent on, I guess, company's own TCFD reporting as well, right? So can you talk a little bit about whether you're seeing progress with respect to companies adopting the framework and actually putting forth information that could then guide our own report?
Excuse me, do you really mean related to the privates, or do you mean just across the board?
Across the board.
Across the board.
Yeah.
I think on the public side, a lot of the analysis that we sort of, you can see the seeds of planted here related to sort of the physical risk and also the transition risk. Some of that is reported by the companies. Some of that comes from just analysis we've been able to do internally and through reviewing a lot of research from industry and academic research as well to get to our own sort of risk analysis over our very large portfolio. For the privates, we've actually been going through portfolio holdings, sort of almost one by one, to sort of do some assessment of their various climate risks.
Okay. And then I thought the report, maybe because we are viewed as a leader in this area, might benefit from maybe a concluding section about, not recommendations, but maybe some direction setting with respect to what are some of the things that could be beneficial that we could be doing going forward that would help with the transition and protecting our investments. And it could be things like advocating for a carbon pricing, and certainly we're going to be very heavily involved with that, additional climate reporting. But I just think with all of the global kinds of initiatives that we're a part of, that having a section like that might be helpful in terms of just a future direction setting kind of framework. And then my last question has to do with at what point do you think, this is kind of the $64 million question, are we going to be able to include Scope 3 reporting in the carbon footprint? Yeah. Okay. And maybe explain what Scope 3 is for those who don't know.
So for Beth Rickman, Sustainable Investments, Scope 3 emissions are what you could think of as indirect emissions of a company. So this is upstream emissions through a supply chain for a company, or downstream emissions through sort of use of a company's products. So it's a pretty broad landscape of types of emissions, if you think about it, with a 10,000 company portfolio related to Scope 3. So there is a challenge there. I guess there are a couple of things I want to say about Scope 3 to answer your question. One, Scope 3 matters. It absolutely matters to us. We need to be thinking about it. It's a large source of emissions, and it's something that we actually did analyze as part of this, and it was included in the analysis that our two consultants provided. But at this stage, there are very few companies that are actually reporting their Scope 3 emissions, and even ones that do, they're not audited. There's quality issues, and so we do have, I could give you a range of where we are in terms of what the consultants provided, which is a range of between 58 and 68 million tons of CO2 per year based on the 2018 year. Now, that's a very large number, and if you look at our report, you'll see that for our global equity portfolio for Scope 1 and Scope 2, it was only about 23 million. So you might wonder, why is that so large? And there are a couple things I would say about that. One, Again, the data quality is something that we're concerned about because, in fact, both ISS and MSCI, which were the two consultants we used, basically said that they found the numbers to not be reliable. So that's one thing. I mean, they both had that. And also, when you think about a portfolio as complicated as Calpers and in as many industries, you've also got to think that when you're doing Scope 3 analysis, you're going to have not only double counting, but perhaps triple counting, maybe quadruple counting. And just to give a basic example, a company in our portfolio, let's take an auto manufacturer, like a GM or a Ford. Let's take GM. So GM, when customers buy those cars from GM and they drive those cars, they're creating Scope 3 emissions for GE. Okay, so they're driving them. But let's say they fill up their GM cars at an Exxon gas station. Well, then they're now driving the GM car, creating Scope 3 emissions for GM in our portfolio, but also Scope 3 emissions for Exxon in our portfolio. So that's just two layers so that's a double counting. But then imagine that is a fleet of GM trucks that is then owned by another company in our portfolio. that would be another company Scope 3 emissions. So quickly we get to triple counting. And so that's something that it's not easy with a 10,000 company portfolio to tease out to really get to good data. So we can report Scope 3, but at this point, and we, again, think it's very important that companies analyze this and report on it because we want them to manage this. We want GM to think about the Scope 3 emissions and manage the efficiency of that vehicle fleet. But for us as an asset owner, those numbers are, difficult to have a lot of confidence in just because of the multiple double countings that would be going on.
Let me just add to what Beth says, and she's quite right. It's fiendishly complicated. However, just because something's difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't make an effort. So we take the point very well, and the point here, I think, is that we are asking companies to report on Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. So Shell is one of the companies in Climate Action 100 that's agreed to take responsibility for all of its emissions. So when oil is being drilled, there's emissions. Then when oil is being refined, there's electricity used. That's Scope 2. Scope 3 is when you and I go and fill up our car, if we're using petrol or gas, and burn that product. So Scope 3 is where most of the emissions lie. But as Beth says, it's a very, very tricky area to get good numbers. So I think what we'd like to do is take this back in the final drafting and see what we can introduce so that we're not underestimating. Because I think it's better to be in a range of approximation rather than very precisely underestimating what the emissions are in the portfolio. And then we continue to work with the standard setters, because really the only way this will get fixed is when the reporting requirements become mandatory. And that's very clearly Calpers' position. And as I said, we've just had a big opportunity open up with IFRS, which is outside the US, the main accounting framework worldwide. So that things are moving.
Okay, great. And then just lastly, the two areas that I raised with respect to the proxy voting section, I think just an explanation or a flavor of what some of the proxy issues were. And then with respect to the
We're looking for our colleague.
and not for here. I mean, I think for the report itself. Yeah.
Okay.
And then
That's
on
the good work of Samiso and Zima.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's in the
And
back.
then on the engagement section, what we have done, Calpers solely, and then certainly what we've done in terms of being lead engager in Climate Action 100 plus. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. To sort of piggyback on Controller Yee's comments, when I asked Ann and Ben to have this pulled, I also was concerned about Scope 3. So I want to encourage you, even if we're double reporting, it's better to have it over-reported, like you said, than to try to get it so analyzed that you're actually under-reporting. So I think it should go in our final copy before we turn it over for Scope 3 emissions. The report is great, and I congratulate you on all of the hard work it takes to go into this report. I know it all got dumped on your lap with the legislation, so, Beth, thank you so much for all this work that you've done, and I really appreciate it. Whoops, I lost my little thing I was working on here. So I wanted to also ask, there's a couple of things. There was, in the very beginning, it talked about the lack of data, and you have expanded upon that. But my thinking is, and I know we've got all kinds of different measuring, we've got TCFD, we've got, like you said, MSCI, SSN. I'm wondering, and I know that that's not standardized yet, but I'm wondering, as we're taking into account how it impacts the financial industry, we need to take the science of climate change itself and the actual facts behind that, because that's all settled science. So I think that needs to be, I don't know if you want to put a paragraph in here that we accept the settled science. We know it impacts our portfolio, that it is, you know, a material risk. And you kind of said that here, but you didn't directly link it to that. So I'm wondering if maybe we could do that, because I kind of go by the science. Since we don't have any way to measure it otherwise, that's kind of my thing. Let's say that the science is there. And then finally, hold on, I got to get to it. Again, congratulations on the CIO award. That's amazing. That is, I know when we went to PRI how much of a forward thinker we are. We are in California, though. So our stakeholders expect so much from us. And I don't expect us to be perfect at this, especially our first round. But I hope to see our next report in 2020 that you guys, I think, what was it called? The carbon emissions data report for 2020? Did I write that down incorrectly?
We're working with some of the wonderful people in the new research strategy group, Nelson DeConsacao and Lauren Watts, to really get our arms around this data. And they're going to be working with Divya Mankikar, and just give this our absolute full attention and best shot so that we can do a TCFD report, as Beth says. That will be for the total fund. It'll be grappling with 1, 2, and 3. We'll navigate our way through all the acronyms and the alphabet soup, but it's very ambitious for us to commit to do that, but it's the right thing, because we should not be saying one thing to others and not be willing to do it ourselves. That's part of our credibility when we talk to companies, I feel. So
right.
We expect first quarter 2020, and the work's already begun.
I'm so much appreciate all of that. And I think because we are so good at this and so forward thinking at this, that and starting Climate Action 100 Plus and Net Zero Alliance, that people sometimes forget that we set the standard for this. The problem is we have to bring the rest of the industries dragging, kicking, and screaming behind us. And I think the financial industry hasn't been real helpful with this either in terms of agreeing to report. So the advocacy that you guys were talking about behind making sure the reporting gets done, I don't know how well we'll be able to do any kind of federal legislation for a while, but I appreciate that you guys are talking about it and moving that needle a little bit. And again, I just want to congratulate you on the report. If we could make sure we get some of this into the report, like Ms. Yee was talking about, the scope 3, even if we're overestimating for now, at least it'll be there. If we're asking our companies in Climate Action 100 to do it, then we probably should do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Oliveros.
Thank you. This is a very helpful report, and I appreciate all the work that goes into it, particularly since the accuracy and quality of the information isn't always there. I think going forward, it would be helpful to see how this translates, especially the transition in physical risks to stranded asset risk, and then how the stranded asset risk could then impact our portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very timely and important issue, and it's something the financial analysts are beginning to comment on. Mm-hmm. There's a group that's feeding into Climate Action 100 called Carbon Tracker, which is analyzing stranded assets sector by sector. So we've got some analysis for oil and gas. They're looking at transport. We have other major sectors coming through. So I think this is one of those issues where we're going to have to take it one piece at a time. Being aware that all these pieces hang together and each sector affects the other. They're not, being affected individually. There's also an initiative that's just been launched at PRI called the Inevitable Policy Response, which I encourage you to take a look at online, because they've actually done some very nice scoping work and scenarios on how different policy measures could lead to assets being stranded. So that's another broader discussion that might be helpful.
Thank you.
One additional thing I'll just add, just so to make sure it's clear, Beth Rickman, is that around the investment office, even when we're not reporting, this is something that our investment analysts are looking at and trying to understand in underwriting new investments, say for our infrastructure or real estate program, in working to understand credit, and this is something that is not just about reporting, it's something that's real that we're thinking about as investors. So I just want to make sure that you understand that as well, and our stakeholders.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor.
Sorry, I forgot one more thing. And Beth, I do get that. I do get that. And I do want to thank you guys. I know we are leaders. And one thing I really wanted to call out, and I forgot to, was that I really appreciate that in the report that you're looking at, and I'm going to quote this, the physical risk to investors' portfolio from climate change. Policy should be designed to avoid exacerbating economic inequality and its associated geopolitical risks, and policies should be designed to provide incentives for carbon sequestration, including through natural methods such as ecosystems protections and restoration. And what I'm taking that to mean is that you're looking at just transition here. And I wanted to call that out and thank you for putting that forward. In terms of advocacy, where is Calpers going to advocate for that? And is that within Climate Action 100, Net Zero Alliance? Is it with the federal government, like I said earlier? So I just wanted to ask that question that I didn't ask before.
No, thank you very much for the question. The just transition is an integral part, as a concept, an integral part of the Paris Agreement. If you read the preamble, it doesn't just talk about workers, but communities, vulnerable communities, the impact on migration from climate change, a whole range of issues. And I think that in order for making progress on the policy front, keeping social cohesion, keeping support for policy measures rests upon making sure that we don't see a backlash, an economic backlash. And I think the yellow vests in France are understood to be an example of how disadvantaged communities can be hit by measures that look good and green, but actually they're going to cause political protest if they're not handled carefully. So where do we go with that idea? Because it's so big and it's actually a public policy issue, and we're an investor, so we need to be very thoughtful about, well, what's our role in thinking this through? So the place it sits at the moment is, first of all, in our engagement work with Climate Action 100+. So we're asking companies to put forward their plans as part of their strategy. Now in Europe, this is a more common area, but I do want to call out big companies like NRG, Big Texas Utility, and ConocoPhillips as examples of companies which are building in the worker transition and impact on communities into their plan. In terms of how the just transition is financed, because these projects take money, the framing for the roundtable on carbon pricing by Notre Dame and the Vatican is carbon pricing for a just transition. And there have been some ideas floated on both Republican and Democratic sides in a bipartisan spirit to be thinking about what would happen with the revenues of a carbon tax. And again, we're not policymakers, we're investors. But it's encouraging if we can get to the point where companies can be talking to policymakers about what will facilitate the transition, rather than what will cause, to coin a phrase, roadblocks. So I hope that's helpful.
All right, I do appreciate it. I think it's important that we, in the conversation, we include workers so that we're seeing them being included, whether that's through transitioning them to the greener jobs, whatever that means. The problem I see, I know we're investors, but if Calpers isn't in the conversation, we're not helping move it. And I think it's important that our voice moves that conversation as well, because we don't have a cohesive government, except in California, governmental message for a just transition. It's worldwide, and I've talked to many investors all over the world, in Europe, Australia, that are working very hard to make sure that the just transition is included in the green economy. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. No requests from the board. I do have a number of requests from the audience that wishes to comment. You'll have up to 3 minutes for your comments. I'll call you down 2 at a time. Sandy Emerson and Tina Gallion.
Good morning. My name is Sandy Emerson, and I'm the board president of Fossil Free California. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this first report for the SB 964 legislation. One effective and timely way to mitigate risks posed by fossil fuel investments would be to decrease such investments. A recent IPCC report states that $200 billion per year must be disinvested from fossil fuel extraction and production, and $100 billion per year must be disinvested from fossil fuel electricity. Every share that remains invested in the most polluting companies that are identified by your Climate Action 100+ research is an obstacle to the kind of investment we need to limit global warming. The SB 964 report could have, and looks like will, disclose the risk of PERS fossil fuel investments on a company-by-company basis. It should have included reports of Scope 3 emissions. The Carbon Disclosure Project made well-qualified data available on companies' Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for your Climate Action 100+ initiative. Calpers used this data to identify the most polluting companies for its lists. The initial 100 focus companies leverage up to 66% of global emissions. As the lead investigator for 22 of these companies, Calpers is in a good position to disclose the climate risk of these investments clearly and specifically. Companies with carbon reserves pose the greatest risks. These primary producers, such as BP, Chevron, Exxon, and Shell, are even now increasing their reserves, even though we already have more than 6 times the amount of carbon reserves that we can safely burn. These companies leverage the Scope 3 emissions that this report should disclose. With more than $8.7 billion invested in primary fossil fuel producers and over $28 billion invested in the energy sector overall, Calpers is carrying great risk. And Calpers still has over $3 billion invested in the thermal coal category defined by the Global Coal Exit Database. I urge you to start somewhere, disclose what you already know, and continue the important discussion that this report deserves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tina Gallier. I'm a member of Fossil Free California, and thank you for the opportunity to comment. Fossil fuels are not going away literally tomorrow, but there are strong indications that the market for them is softening, enough to create reasonable doubt that they are necessarily good investments. Late this year, the Wall Street Journal and Reuters reported that Chevron and Schlumberger wrote down $10 billion and $12.7 billion in assets, respectively, due to a glut of oil and gas on the market, investor concerns about the long-term future of fossil fuels, and a slowdown in shale drilling. And we have seen that coal, once the bedrock of an industrial economy for about 200 years, has been pushed out by natural gas. This year, the $70 billion UC pension system announced it will divest its fossil fuel holdings. So the fact that the chief investment officer for the UC system and the chairman of the UC Board of Regents Investment Committee considered it safe to do so should be taken into account in Calpers investment planning. There is reasonable doubt that fossil fuels are good investments. Therefore, we feel Calpers should consider the possibility of moving these investments to more sustainable sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Next two are Sarah Theis and Sheila Thorne.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Theis, and I am a Calpers retiree and on the board of Fossil Free California. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on the report. I'm going to talk about transition risks, and specifically the first row of the chart on attachment A, the report on page 7, which states, policy, market, and technology changes may result in the loss of value and/or stranding of long-lived and carbon-intense energy assets in our portfolio. I would say that are resulting is a more accurate way to phrase it. As the Wall Street Journal noted this month, oil companies have struggled to reap the profits of old and are falling out of favor with investors amid fears that electric vehicles and renewable energy, along with government regulations to address a warming planet, will constrain their futures. As my colleague mentioned, Chevron wrote down $11 billion in assets this quarter. According to the Wall Street Journal, again, this admission could force others to publicly reassess the value of their holdings in the face of the supply glut and growing investor concerns about the long-term future of fossil fuels. And in a press release, Chevron stated that it is considering alternatives for its gas-related assets, including divestment. It's ironic, isn't it, that in the light of the perfect storm facing the fossil fuel sector, Chevron is considering divestment while apparently Calpers is not. As Tina mentioned, other oil majors are taking similar actions. In addition to Schlumberger, BP and Repsol also wrote down billions. And according to figures I have access to, Calpers has almost $1 billion invested in these 4 companies. It's not surprising that in light of these problems, Moody's just adjusted ExxonMobil's AAA credit rating from stable to negative, raising the prospect of the company being downgraded in 2020. Exxon had a negative cash flow this year, and Moody's expects the same in 2020 and 2021. And Moody's also cited transition risks in terms of its action, specifically emerging threat to oil and gas companies' profitability and cash flow, the growing effort by many nations to mitigate the impacts of climate change through tax and regulatory policies. So I guess my take-home point from this is one made by Ms. Oliveras, and I think others, which is that I personally would like to see, and I think it makes sense to see, more of a link between the science and the actual investment decisions that this board makes, not just in terms of reporting, but actual investment decisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sheila Thorne, and I'm a member of Calpers, and I'm very, very grateful for the benefits I receive. Very grateful. But I also am very worried about the risks to those benefits that are posed by your continued investments in fossil fuels. Not only are fossil fuels losing money right now, as has been pointed out, but there are so many risks which I think that have been underestimated in the report. There are stranded asset risks, which you recognize are not adequately analyzed. There are litigation risks, which are already numerous and will increase with the recent decision by the Philippine Commission on Human Rights that carbon majors can be held accountable. There are regulatory risks, which you don't address, such as the EITI rules and amendments to EU directives, and constant new laws and ordinances passed by U.S. states and cities despite the current administration. For instance, Colorado passed a law this year bolstering local control of fossil fuel development to prioritize public health and safety. Berkeley has passed an ordinance banning natural gas in all new constructions, and other cities are looking into similar measures. And Inside Climate News reports that a November federal court ruling has suspended BLM oil and gas leases in hundreds of thousands of acres throughout the West for ignoring climate impact. Energy companies had bought those leases, so those are stranded assets. These actions will continue, and regulation will be pursued. And as more and more countries, states, and cities transition, a tipping point will eventually occur. The Carbon Tracking Initiative predicts between 2020 and 2027, and most likely by 2023. And investors in fossil fuels will lose a whole lot of money. So I ask you, considering all these risks, why do you continue to invest in fossil fuels?
Thank you. Next two are Deborah Sylvie and Vanessa Warheit.
Good morning, board members. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm Deborah Sylvie, a Calpers retiree and a co-founder of Fossil Free California. In September 2013, I came for the first time to speak to the board in support of the Calpers investment beliefs, number 4 and number 9, which reference the investment risk of climate change. We were pleased that you passed those beliefs, but here we are 6 years later, and the urgency to act on climate risk is far greater than any of us imagined back in 2013. Scientists consistently report that climate threats are coming much earlier than they had thought. Per the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, if what countries have planned for fossil fuel production in the coming decades go as planned, the world will blow past 2 degrees limit, the 2 degrees limit outlined in the Paris Accord. They'll both pass that before 2030. So a sense of urgency should pervade the entire SB 964 report. Unfortunately, so far it does not. First, it does leave out that analysis of the biggest source of emissions in the portfolio, as you've heard, the Scope 3 data. It's too late to wait for perfect data. Scope 3 includes about 80 to 90% of fossil fuel company emissions, and you have about 8% of those fossil fuel companies in your portfolio. So it really should not be left out. Second, there seems no sense of urgency about what's to be done going forward. Calpers points to their gradual approach of engagement, proven fruitless in dealing with fossil fuel companies. Yet Calpers has, as a lead actor with Climate 100 Plus, can act on that data to protect our members' pension funds from harm in the not-so-distant future. And what's coming in the not-so-distant future, as you're hearing, well, what's coming is a collapsing demand, and that's the biggest threat to the fossil fuel sector. Once concern was about peak oil supply, now it's peak oil demand, which may occur as early as 2025. In writing the board last June, Tom Sanzillo, Director of Finance for the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, said, "This new legal requirement comes during a time of broad financial changes in the fossil fuel sector. SB 964 is not merely a legal exercise in compliance, but a more fundamental call for an increased level of prudence and care. So we call for a deeper examination of climate risk, including Scope 3 data." Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for hearing us today. My name is Vanessa Warheit. I'm Executive Director of Fossil Free California. Our organization represents over 1,100 Calpers members, which include my own mother. And I'm here to express our profound disappointment with your CalPERS approach to addressing climate change risk report as mandated by Senate Bill 964, and we're very happy to hear that you're going to be revising it. Many of my colleagues have already spoken about the massive write-downs and mounting climate liability lawsuits that are facing the fossil fuel industry today. So it is disheartening, to say the least, that CalPERS has not taken this opportunity to do the kind of robust reporting necessary to protect our members from climate-related financial risk to their portfolio. Specifically, we are alarmed at the omission of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions data in the analysis of the fund's holdings and their impacts on the climate crisis. And I would like to add, some estimates put it anywhere from 6 to 9 times, not double, but many, many times the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. We are also outraged at PERS's failure to name the companies that put our public funds at risk. As co-sponsors of Senate Bill 964, we believe that these glaring omissions render this report both inadequate and unacceptable. Why is robust reporting critical this year? The bill's author accepted an amendment making the report triennial instead of annual. At a time when the window of opportunity to avert global disaster is now measured in years, the 2019 report needs to provide direction for CalPERS's risk-based investment decisions between now and the end of 2022. And it sets the standard for future reports and for reporting by other funds who look to CalPERS for leadership and essential models. This report, as written, fails to provide either of those. Staff and my colleagues have addressed the report's shocking lack of readily available and crucially important Scope 3 emissions data. I would like to briefly address the report's lack of specificity in attributing risk to industries and companies within the portfolio. In drafting SB 964, the legislature intended for CalPERS to report on the climate-related financial risk of its public market portfolio, which the authors of the bill understood to include discussion of specific holdings by name as well as specific industries. As we stated in our letter to you of June 25th of this year, there is precedent for this discussion in both CalSTRS and CalPERS reports on compliance with SB 185, which requires the funds to divest from thermal coal companies that meet a certain threshold. CalPERS's SB 964 report, however, contains no such discussion of the fund's holdings, making it impossible to accurately assess where and how climate-related risk is distributed. So I urge you in your revisions to include at a bare minimum industry specificity, but really you should be including company specificity so that we know where that risk lies. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perez.
Thank you. I have a question for Ben. Sorry, thanks.
Yes.
Let's, just for sake of argument, let's pretend that we suspended all of the advocacy and the way we are investing currently. Knowing that 7% discount rate is a difficult target for us to reach, if we suspended this program, this one of the beliefs that we have, would that help our returns in the short term?
That's a very complex question. Let me put it in this way. As I said last month in the open session in my opening remarks about item 11B, the unique challenge we face, we are a long-term investor. Long-term risk matters a lot to us, including sustainability, ESG factors. But we also have a short-term challenge. The short-term for one, the challenge every year we need to pay out about $24 billion benefit to the policemen, firefighters, and public workers who have dedicated their entire life to public service. And also, as you said, that in the we also need to be mindful of the survivability of our fund in the short term. Without surviving the fund in the short term, there's no long term to speak to. So I hope that answers your question. It's a very tough balance we need to we need to balance, basically, the long-term survivability and the short-term survivability.
Thanks, Ben. And I hate to put you on the spot, and you kind of answered it, but not really. So I'm hearing yes, that if we suspended this stuff, we should do better in the short term?
No, that's not what I said, sorry. I said it's a complex question. I cannot give you a straight yes or no answer. All I would like to highlight the additional challenge we face when compared to our global peers, who some of them does not even have current liability structure, let alone we need to pay out $24 billion a year, and many of them, they do not have an assumed rate of return at 7%. But given all these together, we view the pension liability as a shared responsibility among Calpers, employers, and employee. So without causing additional stress, financial stress on the employer and employee, the investment office, what we can do is really focus on delivering the 7% return.
Yes, my concern is that we are so focused on engagement and talks of divestment that we're putting too much pressure on the contracting agencies, the cities and the counties that contract us with Calpers for their pensions.
That's true. If we cannot deliver the required rate of return from the investment portfolio, unfortunately, we will be putting on more pressure on the employer and the employee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing else on item 6I. Move to 6J, the responsible contractor policy.
So, Mr. Chair, I forgot to mention, if I may, there is one correction on item 6F, the
6F?
alternative fee reporting, which I would like to introduce my colleague, Matt Flynn, who is acting interim COIO today. Our interim COIO, Dan Bienvenu, is out of the country, so Matt Flynn has kindly offered to step up as the acting interim COIO today, and who will cover the correction in item 6F.
Good morning, Matt Flynn, Calpers team member. Item 6F, which is our AB 2833 report, contained in attachment number 1, page number 1. There was an error in the formation and the formatting of the table that resulted in some inaccurate information. And the most critical piece of it is in the cash profit received column. It is incorrectly stated as printed. However, it will be corrected on the online posting. It should have read $24 million in cash profits received for our absolute return strategies program, and not a negative $760 million as stated. So again, the correction will be online, and it's just currently an issue in the printed version.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did receive an updated report. Is that correct? The updated report we received subsequently to the printing of the agenda?
I believe there was an error earlier in the week that is contained in the updated report that you received. The information we're talking about here this morning was discovered late on Friday afternoon,
So
and I do not believe you've received that yet.
Okay, thank you.
Very good, thank you. Item 6J, responsible contractor policy. Mr. Meng.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with that, I call my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Anne Simpson. I'm joined here by Carrie Douglas-Fong and also Paul Machaka. And it's my pleasure to introduce this item, which is an annual report on the Responsible Contractor Programme. However, it's also painful that I have the task of saying, unfortunately, there was a mistake in one of the tables that was sent to you, which we will correct online. The mistake is an attachment 2 under what's called non-core. And the mistake is a transposition, if you like, Heinz Green in the 4th and 5th column should be 0. And we do apologize for this. What this means is reducing the sums of contracts under the responsible contract policy by $2.5 million. So there's a knock-on effect on the totals shown in the presentation and in the attachment, and we'll be putting that right in the online version. So thank you for your understanding on that.
So on that note, we would like to say that on behalf of the Investment Office, we realize that there have been a couple of errors in the materials presented to the committee. We're looking into it to the root cause of the errors, but regardless, we apologize for the errors, and we'll do our best to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Absolutely. Let me now turn to Carrie Douglas-Fong, who has a presentation to explain the history of this policy and the program attached to it. And Paul Muchaka, who's the Managing Investment Director for Real Assets, will be here to help answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Good morning, Carrie Douglas-Fong, Calpers team member. Today I'm going to provide you with information on the RCP policy, including overview, history, summary results, communication and engagement, and compliance and total contracting. Next slide. The RCP policy applies to domestic real estate and infrastructure assets where Calpers holds greater than 50% interest on contracts of $100,000 or more. Next slide, please. The first mention of the policy was in 1992. Thank you. The RCP policy was carefully drafted by Calpers' external managers, labor, fiduciary counsel, and the board's pension consulting alliance, which is now part of Makita, and staff. We worked together to create the RCP policy for external real estate managers to hire responsible contractors and subcontractors based on local market conditions, all the while maintaining a competitive bidding process that enables an appropriate risk-adjusted return. In 1996, the Calpers Investment Committee approved and established the policy. Over the years, it has evolved. There were 2 periods of extensive review and revision, the first between 2010 and 2013, and the second between 2014 and 2015. Over this 5-year period, the Investment Committee, so you, asked staff to spend significant resources reviewing and revising the policy. At the Investment Committee's request, staff initiated engagement with labor stakeholders and investment managers on the RCP policy. Each review included multiple discussions and written communication with all sides. Staff, PCA, and fiduciary counsel worked with managers to make sure that real assets could continue to remain competitive in the marketplace while being sensitive to the requests of the labor community. The results were a groundbreaking neutrality trial for core real estate and infrastructure, applying to service contractors and subcontractors, which is now a permanent part of the policy, significantly increasing manager responsibilities and establishing roles for unions, external investment managers, contractors, and staff, and the creation of an enhanced certification of responsible contractor, which increased requirements for all of our subs and contractors while still retaining enough flexibility for managers to be competitive. Next slide, please. Summary results. All managers provided a report including dollars paid under the policy and a certification that they and their contractors and subcontractors have complied with the policy. Importantly, managers reported that there were no adverse material impacts on returns. communication and engagement. Staff communicates regularly and proactively with labor stakeholders and Calpers real asset managers regarding the policy. We hold quarterly calls with many of the labor stakeholders that have concerns regarding the policy to make sure that we can be proactive in addressing any concerns. When specific things come up, often at a local level, we address them as quickly as possible. Often these issues are outside of the policy, such as when Calpers does not own the asset. I also want to note that the policy encourages direct communication between labor stakeholders, Calpers external real estate managers, and potential contractors. And this is noted on page 10 of the appendix of the PowerPoint. Compliance and total contracting. For the last fiscal year ending June 30th, 2019, managers reported a combined 99.98% compliance with the policy, paying over $841 million to contractors certifying as responsible contractors under the policy. This compliance percentage is comparable with previous years' reporting. Over the last few years, more than $5.4 billion, and the 6.4 is incorrect, in line with what Ann reported. That should also be changed. To support and encourage fair wages and benefits based on local market conditions. The policy requires managers and contracts to consider responsible wages and benefits in the contracting process. And all winning bids are required to sign a certification saying they are a responsible contractor. In closing, the policy has been replicated by many other public pension funds and investors, and it sets a standard in the marketplace in which we invest, not just for ourselves, but for other investors as well. The RCP policy was developed to provide a framework for responsible contracting on Calpers investments by the Calpers board. The goal being to have flexibility in the framework to contract responsibly while still ensuring a competitive risk-adjusted return. And with that, go back to Ann.
Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate the report. I'm the one that keeps pulling these things out. I'm sorry. But it's just, I think that we need to highlight that we, again, are a leader in this. And I don't think we tell that story well enough. And I want to make sure that the report got brought to the public's attention rather than sitting back in the information consent items. That was number one. Because we have such great compliance on our RCP program, I think that we are, we set the standard. I hear that often from other folks in the industry. I just do want to caution us. The only thing I have is I want to caution us as we respond to like a labor request as they come in. I'm trying so that we're not letting things drop through the cracks. I'm hoping that, for example, I'll give a specific. So, for example, if a labor contractor applies, it's an expensive process to do a state application. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of making sure that you have all the right requirements, right, to as a contractor for a building. So I think I'm a little concerned in that process because I'm hearing that a lot of unionized labor contractors that are applying, and it's not necessarily just Calpers, it's perhaps, and I haven't heard specifics that it is Calpers, but that sometimes it's not even worth them applying because they don't, other contractors that aren't compliant, but have like gone out of business, started a new business, so that they are no longer on that list of non-compliant companies. Those companies are getting it, they're underbidding because they don't have to pay the benefits that union labor has to pay. So I'm just concerned that maybe the listing of these companies that are not compliant or have violated regulations in building, et cetera, do we have that listing? And is that something that we refer to when we're looking at who, maybe not us, but whoever our company is, like, that we use for building?
So each manager keeps a list of both responsible contractors and non-responsible contractors. If there's a specific instance, it would be helpful for me to understand what specifically the issue was. I know there was one instance with a manager that Calpers does use where an accusation was made that they did exactly what you're saying. I did look into that issue, and Calpers is not any way invested in the property. We've had other issues like that have been brought to our attention, and I can assure you that we take them very seriously, and we as quickly as possible look into the concerns of labor leaders. So anyone who has concerns like that, I would encourage them to reach out directly to us. I'm unaware of any situation where we were not able to resolve it upon talking to both labor and the manager.
And I appreciate that. I do know you do listen to that. Thank you very much. It seemed like it's something that we can mitigate before that, because these companies, these building companies, unfortunately, a lot of times are in violation of a lot of our requirements, and sometimes even worse, right? Sometimes even just labor law in general, or safety laws, health and safety laws. And like I said, they either stop doing business under that name, start it up under another name, or somehow or another they get their recertification under Rcp. And I don't know how that happens. I'm just wondering if we have a way to mitigate that as we moving forward.
We have a 24-month look back, which is part of our certification, and it does specifically speak not just to the company but also to the officers. In one instance, there was a company that labor leaders let us know there was a violation. There was actually more than one company that they claimed there were violations. In one of them, we found there to be thoroughly researched it. We did not find there to be any violations, and the manager moved forward. On the other one, there was approximately $1 million in fines and back wages, and the manager found that to not be a responsible contractor. And they lied on their certification, and they did not move forward with that particular manager. So, as I said, any of these particular instances, we're happy to handle them. Sometimes in looking at them thoroughly, we find that there's credibility and the evidence that the contractor is not responsible. In other instances,
it's not.
They are.
Yeah. Okay, great. Again, Ms. Fong, Ms. Simpson, Mr. Machaca, Mr. Meng, thank you for pulling these out for us and letting us highlight these. And again, great report. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Oliveris.
Thank you. Carrie, I had a quick question for you. I'm trying to understand how the RCP impacts risk mitigation and value retention within our portfolio.
That's a great question. I think that as early as 1992, the board made it clear that we didn't want to be using substandard labor, and there are real estate investors who pull people off street corners. We felt it was important to be using responsible labor, both because that ensures that you've got a good product, and in terms of services, it ensures that the service personnel in your building are providing appropriate services. One specific example I'll give is that when we moved to neutrality with services, we found that janitorial service, the people the janitors were staying longer than they had under the prior system. So, a very specific example is we make a change in the policy, the wages for janitors go up slightly at our properties, and they discover that doing that, the janitors are staying, instead of 6 months, they're staying a year, 18 months. And what they found in doing that is that the tenants were actually much happier with the janitorial services they were receiving. So that would be a very specific example of how the policy had benefited. And Paul, do you have anything to add?
Good morning, Paul Muchaka, Calpers staff. Yeah, our core real estate portfolio is circa $29 billion of equity, and much like you would, and we look to hold those assets over a long period of time, through a business cycle at least. And much like you would protect the value of your own home by hiring, an appropriate contractor to do whatever work, it applies that same type of principle, that you want the best possible labor, the best quality of work, but being mindful of your bottom line. And what the responsible contractor policy does, I don't think only attempts to do, but really has been proven out in its history, is to really find that balance between managing the bottom line and at the same time protecting the assets for the long term, and ensuring that we're applying appropriate labor practices, hiring high quality laborers to do the work that's necessary, and really to protect the asset for the long term.
Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Douglas Fong, I just want to thank you for your work in regard to the RCP policy, because I know a decade ago we were getting some complaints, and you were very working on it expeditiously, responding to those complaints and ironing out their concerns and bringing the firms into compliance. And so just looking at the data, 14 out of the 15 companies are 100% in compliance. And I think that's a good reflection of what has occurred. And also, in terms of the value of our portfolio during that same decade, it's gone up over $10 billion. So there is a correlation to good practices and growth in value. So I just wanted to let you know that we appreciate the work you've done in this regard.
Thank you. I do have some requests to speak from the audience. It's three of you. I'll call you all down. Michael Ring, Carolina Roca, and Andrew Gayton. You'll have up to 3 minutes for your comments, and please identify yourself for the record.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Happy holidays. Michael Ring with Service Employees International Union. I'm here today with SEIU USWW member Carolina Rocha, SEIU USWW Vice President Andrew Gross-Gaitan behind me, and two more USWW members, Julia Velez and Maria Elena Delgado. Julia and Maria Elena have cleaned the Calpers headquarters for many years. In Maria Elena's case, for 17 years. She's kept this building running and clean. We wanted to share some brief comments with you today with regard to the Responsible Contractor Program, and also share some details about newly passed legislation this fall, AB 547. And we believe AB 547 is legislation which calls for important changes in the process of ensuring that all janitors in the state of California receive adequate training to prevent sexual harassment and sexual violence in the janitorial industry in California, which we believe is a critical risk mitigation factor for Calpers and its portfolio. Carolina and Andrew will share the details around AB 547, so let me focus my comments on the Responsible Contractor Program. And first of all, let me join Mr. Jones in thanking Ms. Douglas Fong for her excellent work. She puts up with me and a lot of our other folks in the labor community and working with us to ensure that your buildings are both built in a responsible manner and serviced and cleaned and securitized in a manner that is to the benefit of all CalPERS beneficiaries and to the workforce that ensures the building's value over the long haul. And as an organization that represents over 200,000 members in the CalPERS system and tens of thousands of workers across North America who provide first-class service, both janitorial and security and other services in buildings across the continent, SEIU sees this as a model program and has always understood that CalPERS was a leader in the investment industry and understanding that responsible contracting is critical to human capital management risk. Excuse me. We appreciate CalPERS' leadership in this regard, and we believe that it facilitates a long-term sustainable business model that works for workers and investors. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee, and with that I will turn it over to Carolina. And just a logistical issue for you to note, Mr. Chair, is that Carolina will be speaking in Spanish, so Andrew will be translating for her. Thank you very much.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Carolina Rocha, tengo 21 años trabajando en la industria de la limpieza. Soy parte de la mesa ejecutiva del SEIU USWW, que representa a 25,000 janitors a nivel estatal. También soy capacitadora del Centro Yabasta.
Good morning, my name is Carolina Rocha. I've been working in the janitorial industry for 21 years. I'm part of the executive board of SEIU, United Service Workers West, which represents some 25,000 janitors statewide. I've also been trained in sexual harassment violence prevention at the Ya Basta Center.
100 de mis compañeros y compañeras hemos completado más de 80 horas de entrenamiento para poder recibir nuestro certificado del Estado de California.
100 of my coworkers and myself have completed over 80 hours of training to be able to receive our certificate as sexual harassment trainers.
Y poder educar a nuestros compañeros sobre el acoso y el abuso sexual en la industria a nivel estatal.
In order to be able to train our coworkers in the janitorial industry about sexual abuse and sexual harassment.
Hemos trabajado duro para poder pasar la AB 547, una ley que permitirá el cambio de la cultura en la industria.
We worked very hard to get AB 547 passed this year. That's a law which will allow us to begin to change the culture in this industry.
Donde janitors sobrevivientes seremos los maestros y maestras que empoderen a los janitors.
Under that law, janitors who are survivors of sexual assault will be able to be trained as teachers to be able to train our coworkers about this issue.
Donde nosotros somos el centro de la estrategia preventiva y donde los compañeros sabrán sus derechos y que pueden reportarlo.
And that way, we're the center of the solution to this problem and helping our coworkers understand their rights and how to report what happens.
Gracias, Calpers, por ser un dueño de edificios que creen el poder de los janitor en cambiar la industria.
We want to thank Calpers for being an owner in the industry that is helping to change this issue.
Y que también ha tomado medidas para combatir el acoso sexual en los edificios.
Your belief in the power of the janitors has helped us to take measures to combat sexual assault in the buildings.
Al formar parte de estos programas, Calpers está mandando un mensaje que el acoso sexual no será tolerado en sus edificios.
By supporting these programs like the responsible contracting, Calpers is sending a message that sexual violence will not be tolerated in its buildings.
Y juntos podremos trabajar para que todos los edificios sean una zona de dignidad y donde no se tolerará la violencia sexual.
And together we can work to make sure that the buildings will be dignified workplaces where sexual violence will not be tolerated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I did. So as Michael said, I'm the regional vice president for SEIU, United Service Workers West. We do represent some 25,000 unionized janitors in California. Our mission has never been just to improve the conditions for the workers with the union. There are over 130,000 workers in California whose employers at least report payroll taxes to EDD. There's an untold number who are working in the underground economy, who are paid in cash, and it is also an industry that's rife with human trafficking. So what we have done as a union, and Calpers has over the years been very supportive, is try to look at changing the legislative situation for the entire industry, beginning with the issue of wage theft, which is janitorial industry is one of the worst in the state, if not the country, for wage theft. And what I mean by that is workers who come to work and are not paid for all the hours they work, who work through their lunches and breaks, who work overtime and are simply told that overtime is not allowed, or who come to the buildings with their family and perhaps one person might be on payroll, but the children who are coming are not. What we have done to deal with the very issue that Ms. Taylor referenced is it's well known in this industry when employers finally get judgments against them for wage theft, they simply change names and enter into the market as a new employer. What we have done in SB 588, which was passed in 2015, is to make sure that the liability for wage theft follows not only the janitorial contractor and the individual owners of those companies, but also the owners of the buildings whose offices the janitors are cleaning. And when we speak to the issue of financial responsibility and the importance of the responsible contracting standard, it is currently California law that the owners of real estate in California can be held joint and severally liable for wage theft in their buildings. Sexual harassment and sexual violence is also endemic in this industry. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage all of you to take a look at the PBS Frontline special called Rape on the Night Shift, which features countless women who have been subject to sexual violence in the industry. It's a perfect setup for sexual violence. It's a heavily immigrant industry, primarily male supervisors, primarily women workers, and generally working alone at night where there's no one to see what happens. We also know it's an industry that has a tremendous number of undocumented workers who are subject to all kinds of intimidation because of their immigration status. And what we have found in terms of Calpers' role and the impact of the responsible contracting policy, as we've organized this industry in California over the last 30 years, we've been able to bring healthcare as a norm, at least among the 25,000 who are unionized. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of children in California who have healthcare because of the ripple effect of Calpers' policies. To have an institutional investor of Calpers' size be the role model for all the major real estate entities in whom you invest and state that the quality of life and respect for human rights of the workers who clean their buildings is a substantial investment priority, has had an effect which, as I said, has been able to bring health care to hundreds of thousands of children in California. And the impact on longevity is very clear. Calpers in 2003, when the janitors struck...
Come to an end, your time is up.
Okay. When the janitors in Sacramento struck, Calpers was an essential ally in telling the real estate owners that it did matter that they use responsible contractors. Carolina was one of those strikers and has been in the industry for 21 years. And she has any number of colleagues here in this city who have stayed in the industry for 15, 20, 25 years because of the health care. So I would like to express our appreciation to Calpers for taking this leadership role. There are many other industries affected by your contracting policies, but the janitorial industry is certainly one of the industries that has benefited the most, not only the workers in the buildings, but also their families. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. Brings us to item 7. Mr. Meng.
Yes, Mr. Chair, item 7 is action item, which is the second reading of the investment policy revision of our private assets. So with that, I will turn over to my colleague, Kit.
Thank you and good morning. Kit Crocker, Calpers staff. Item 7A is a second reading of staff's proposed updates to the private equity and real assets program policies arising out of this year's annual review. For private equity, we're proposing refinements to the definition of customized investment account to afford staff sufficient latitude in selecting the best partner for these specialized accounts. For real assets, the two primary changes are expressing the managing investment director's fiscal year limits at the program, that is to say, real assets level instead of at the portfolio level, and also relocating the program-specific leverage constraints to the policy-related procedures. And this is consistent with the centralization of leverage management at the total fund level that has been discussed here numerous times before. Since the first reading in November, the only change you'll see today is a proposed rewording of the new definition of customized investment account in response to board feedback at the November investment committee meeting. And just as a reminder regarding 2 of the proposed strikeouts, the duty to report policy violations to this committee is now contained in one overarching, all-encompassing statement in the total fund investment policy. So since this is a second reading, we're seeking action by the committee, and I'll pause there and ask if there are any questions or comments, and also invite Wilshire and Makita to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Yee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm still troubled by this, and I'm just trying to understand this a little bit better. And so the customized investment account definition, and the revisions intended to hopefully give us more flexibility and to provide a larger pool of potential private equity investments. I get the goal. But I guess I'm curious as to how you would weigh a general partner's track record under the proposed revisions. So if there's a disagreement, let's say, between staff and the consultant providing the prudent person opinion on the customized investment account, how would that get resolved? I'm still kind of just trying to see this in practice and how this would work.
Okay, and I may want to invite someone from private equity up, or perhaps from Wilshire, but it's my understanding that we simply don't want to tie staff's hands, since the prior definition was too limited in terms of the factors staff could take into account. And track record is necessarily backwards looking, not forward looking, and there could be other factors that would dictate a different answer than if you're narrowly bound by that former definition.
Okay. I understand that, and I guess with respect to private equity, I would imagine that we're going to be engaging with probably a number of new managers, and so I guess I just found the definition to be, I guess, weaken rather than strengthen, even though I understand what the goal is. So I'm having a hard time reconciling.
Yeah, and the goal is certainly not to weaken it. It is to give staff the latitude that they need to make the correct decision, because picking the best partner is perhaps a more subtle decision than was reflected in the prior definition.
Okay, so I guess maybe back to the question of how, if there is a conflict or disagreement between staff and the consultant providing the prudent person opinion on a customized investment account, how would that get resolved?
I would say typically we don't proceed, but Ben, do you?
If I may, so I see two questions in your question. For one, in terms of the historical performance track record, it is known that in private market that depending on which database you use and which time period, you can get quite different results. So when you're looking at and also when you look at the past performance, the reason the past performance may be relevant is only in the sense that it may help us to predict the future performance. So instead of just looking at the numbers, which is imperfect because we don't have all, no index provider has all the data, like in the public market. When the team underwrite managers, we look for what are the driving factors behind the past performance. Is that the people or investment philosophy or their investment processes or the better alignment of interest? So we can go beyond the past performance because of the limitation for past performance. And the more important you ask is whether these people, the same people, same skills still preside with the firm. And then you ask the question, are these still the right skills for the future? It could be the right people, right skill for the past to be successful. So it's much more than just looking at the past performance. So that's the first question. The second one, you're asking if there's a difference between the staff and consultants. For one, we try to resolve all the difference between the staff and consultants. And for that, I'm very happy to report that the staff has a very constructive working relationship with the private equity, the private asset consultants, as well as the general pension consultants. And in my recollection, it did happen in the past. There were rare occasions the staff and the prudent person opinion disagree. And I believe in that case, we brought all the cases to the board, to this body, and we have a full discussion and then make a decision together. So it's not, it's not required for the consultant staff to be on the same page all the time. Right. We challenge each other all the time. We learn from each other all the time. But when there's a disagreement, definitely brings to this investment committee.
Okay. All right. So that process wouldn't change. So potentially we could see some of those disagreements come before us should it arise in the
Correct.
future. Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Correct. That process would not change.
Okay. And that's helpful with respect to looking at track record, because I think in my own head I was thinking about, if we're talking about existing managers, the fact that we have a lot of dry powder out there, just like what are the considerations? And so obviously, I mean, I don't want to hamper staff's flexibility, but at the same time, I want to be sure that what we're looking at relative to track record is something that will be helpful.
Correct, exactly. As I said, we're trying to look beyond the track record because of the limitation of the track record.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ruiz, anything you want to add? Okay. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kit, I have a question for you again on the removal of the language in these specific sections and going to the overall, the overarching policy. I want to make sure that, one, the wording has not changed at all, and two, before, when there was a violation, it would come to the next meeting. But now those meetings are quarterly. And so I'm wondering if the board is going to be notified in advance of that quarterly meeting, or what if that violation or issue is corrected? Will we hear about it at all?
Well, to answer that last question first, definitely. I mean, frequently these violations have been corrected. I would hope more typically by the time they get here. And I had at least assumed that they would be collected and presented quarterly, that's certainly open to, we don't have to do it that way. It's open to what the board would like to see done. Certainly in open meeting, we would have to do them quarterly, but there might be another way to share them in the interim. And then in terms of, is it identical language? I think so, except that the existing program level language refers to problems, concerns, and policy violations. And we didn't see the difference between problems and concerns, so we did collapse that for the sake of some economy. And just in the overarching statement in the total fund, it refers, I believe, to just problems instead of problems and concerns.
But they're the same to
It is supposed to be substantively identical.
Great, thank you. And then I had a question for, I guess maybe it's for Makita. I was reading the opinion that's attached to this. And what I read was, I'm on 7A, attachment 7. I don't know if I'm in the right page, on the right spot. But one of the Stevens wrote, if adopted, the proposed changes to the policy would provide staff with an expanded set of potential CIA sponsors to choose from, and thereby increase staff's ability to select attractive, appropriately experienced managers to partner with. So are there specific examples of when we haven't been able to partner with someone because they didn't meet the policy? Do you know of specific examples? I mean, I know I don't want to go into anything closed session, but just generally? Because we're expanding this policy, so I want to make sure that we're expanding it for a specific reason.
I believe so, but again, I do point out, let me find out the names, and then hopefully I can bring back to you in closed session this afternoon.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that there's specific reason for expanding and broadening this policy, especially when we talk about the experience of the managers, because before it said they had to have specific experience. Can you help me with that terminology? Now we're saying appropriately experienced. I'm trying to understand the difference between the two.
So what is specifically your question? Whether there's ever been
two parts.
An investment approved that was not appropriate? I'm trying to understand exactly.
No, like we had a deal, but we had a potential, but we couldn't do it because it didn't meet this definition.
Well, recall, so the answer is no. And what was the situation previously, it had to meet the top quartile definition. And that was a very limited set of opportunities. And there's been relatively few customized investment accounts over the last couple of years.
And then the second part about the appropriately experienced, are we changing the definition of experience for those CIAs?
So that, if I recall the definition, at the November meeting, there was a suggestion that the language that was provided in that draft was a little too loose.
Liberal.
And that as a suggestion, staff has proposed the word appropriate. And trying to capture some of the nuances there, and having the staff, having the manager have some connection to the strategy, right? Trying to give some comfort there that the track record, the staff capabilities of the manager are reflected of what this customized investment account would be going forward. To use the word appropriate was selected to try to be the adjective to put on there.
And as our consultant, you agree that that's appropriate?
Yes, I think it's appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, a couple questions on the prudent person opinion. When there's a disagreement, you indicated that it would be presented back to the board. But I also would like to not only have it presented to the board, but also the firm that's providing the prudent person opinion be also before the board to talk about their disagreements. So if we could add that to the process, I think it would be helpful. The other comment is this just a second here. Oh, and maybe the way I'm reading it, perhaps is incorrect, but I would like for you to explain it. Where while I recognize that backwards looking does not always predict success going forward, but here you're saying that the top quartile is almost like eliminated from going forward, but you have to also always look and see what happened in the past. So I'd just like you to expand on your letter there, Makita, about the backwards looking at the top quartile.
Because the prior definition before these amendments had the criteria that the manager had to have a top quartile track record in order to be considered, my point was that, and I think the staff's point is too, is to have a more expanded set of opportunities to look from, and that while track record is a very important component to assessing the GP or the manager's potential ability to deliver strong returns, it shouldn't be the only one, because it does restrict that set of opportunities, and that by choosing a criteria that is backward-looking, that doesn't incorporate a number of the considerations that Ben was talking about just a moment ago, that with the idea of having that broader investment set to choose from, to not include not to limit the universe because of a backward-looking criteria.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, with that, I'll move approval of the private equity class program policy revisions.
All right, it's been moved by Jones. Is there a second? Seconded by Taylor. Ms. Oliveros.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question too, getting back to the definition of customized investment account. It seems like there's questions about the term appropriate, really, and what that means, and this is to Makita. Are there other adjectives we could consider there, such as leading or something else that would speak to the potential performance? So that, because appropriate is very vague.
As this item was being reviewed and we were discussing it with staff, we had some discussion about what's the right adjective to use here. And we thought that having an adjective that does tie the kind of experience that the manager has with what the forward strategy of the customized investment account makes sense. But again, with the idea of trying to give staff as much latitude as possible to look at things, and recognizing that staff will look to try to get strong managers. That's what they are looking to try to do as they're executing on the program, as well as the PPO opinion being included as the entire package. So having that additional set of eyes, and that provider of the opinion would also be making that fiduciary statement to go along with it. I think as a package overall, it works for us. Could we spend a lot of time figuring out other words and then not really understanding what in practice it probably means? We could maybe spend some more time on it, but I think that at the end of the day, it's getting to the point where I think overall it's a package that will
hopefully provide a strong set of investment opportunities for the Calpers staff to choose from.
Has the term appropriate been defined anywhere in this language, such as commensurate with the size and the obligations of the fund and the performance targets, anything like that?
Actually, if I may, the drafting choice we were faced with was to either expand the list of characteristics of experience, types of experience that we see here, and then risk maybe omitting something that should have been in the list, or to say basically appropriate to the particular investment, because we cannot foresee exactly what sort of investment opportunities we're going to be looking at.
Right, I
with one of these
understand that.
vehicles. So the choice of the word appropriate, I would urge that we just allow it to have its ordinary English meaning, which means, and recognizing that we're always looking to optimize returns, and especially in this asset class, we have high expectations. So it's really appropriate is not intended to replace, I think maybe we're focusing that as replacing the top quartile return track record, and it's really the whole basket of, should we be looking for more expertise in terms of geography of a particular investment, or type of industry, or what other bucket of experience might apply. So that's why we settled on appropriate as basically, it was really meant to address the perceived deficiencies, the comments we got in November, where we had eliminated these specific attributes and not basically said something that tied, however, the types of experience to the particular investment opportunity. So appropriate to me actually seems like the best designed word to basically say this is something that, in light of this investment opportunity, is what we want in a manager.
To my knowledge, appropriate isn't a common financial term, so I'm just not used to seeing it in this context. I'm used to seeing something like prudent, although I don't know that prudent and private equity always go hand in hand. And so I'm just trying to understand how this term could be interpreted. And if there were some type of definition around that, or some about the meaning of this and the intent of that word, I think that would be helpful, because appropriate is pretty big.
We could spend some time with staff to try to come up with some additional definition, but I think that, as been described, it's hard to foresee all of the conditions that one might need to think about in the future. And also, as Ms. Crocker had mentioned, in some cases might look for someone's industry expertise, in other cases it might be geographic.
Sure.
And there's different sorts of criteria that might be, at the end of the day, appropriate for the particular customized investment account. So it's a bit of a challenge. We're trying to make sure that there is appropriate consideration done by staff in coming up with an investment opportunity, but also that the PPO is there, that eventually has a third party that's saying that it is a prudent investment.
There are terms like suitable. There are other things that have been used. I'm just surprised that we're using financial term. This isn't typical financial terminology, and it has a pretty big impact. But I also had another question, and this was about attachment 1. And this was on the reporting frequency. So it's 7A attachment 1, page 4. And it's on the monthly reporting on the investment proposals received.
Sorry, what was the question?
So it says staff shall report regarding investment proposals it has received on a monthly basis. That seems very frequent. Is there a reason why we're not going to do that quarterly to align with the investment committee meetings?
I would think that the typo should be quarterly, given that we're moving to quarterly investment committee meeting next year.
And now might actually be a good time to point out that we are, in fact, completing the integration of our investment policies. We've sort of come full circle, or I rather completed the journey almost to a total fund view. So the program policies are actually a relic of a past, a sort of legacy when before we had the total one fund view. And now going forward, we're going to be looking to integrate into one total fund policy. So that, in light of the new quarterly meetings, appreciate pointing that out, because I think that should probably go to quarterly.
And on the item below it, on the consultant reporting, right now that's no less than annually in this document. Is it possible for that to be made quarterly?
That certainly could be quarterly.
Thank you.
Anything else, Ms. Oliveris?
No, thank you.
Ms. Taylor?
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe we should make it a chair request to review the terminology that Ms. Oliveris and Ms. Brown were talking about. If it's not typical financial terminology, I don't see a reason we can't change that. So I'm wondering if the chair would like to make a stance on that.
That's fine with me. I'd be happy to look at it with staff. I also don't want us to get too deep into the weeds on just wording. I mean, we certainly employ our staff to do a job, and I think that we can rely on you to do so. But again, if we can find some words that are more compatible, I think it's appropriate. Come on, it was good.
Thank
Kit and I
you.
just talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Kit and I was talking. Actually, the word "suitable" is appropriate for this purpose.
All right. Any other discussion on the motion? Motion be before you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Thank you. Brings us agenda item 8. The information item, consultant review of the investments.
Yes. So this is a consultant review on Calpers divestments, and that will be by our consultants, Wilshire.
Sorry, pressing the wrong one there. Good morning. Daniel.
Before you begin, just notice that we're almost to the court reporter's break, so let's take 10 minutes, and then we'll begin at 11:05.